Hi everyone, welcome to this sixth and I think probably for the time being the final curriculum primer video. This one is going to be about shared resources and how we make them as effective as possible, and it's worth just reminding ourselves of the journey we've been on so far. So in the first video we looked at a knowledge-rich curriculum and this idea that it's trying to balance these two kind of variables, I suppose, of rigor and accessibility, and that in its truest form, I think a knowledge-rich curriculum is trying to do both. It's trying to make disciplinary knowledge accessible to all students, but in a way that's rigorous enough to allow students to go on and specialise. And we looked at that in a bit more detail in the fourth part, this idea that we're trying to balance the kind of general and specialised aspects of education. In the fifth video, in the last video, we looked at how you would organise lessons within a sequence, and making sure that each lesson you return to these kind of big ideas or core concepts, whatever we want to call them, and make those explicit to students. What we'll look at in this video is really how we can use shared resources to make sure that these quite kind of big, nebulous, ambitious ideas can be captured and brought alive in every single classroom within a department. And a really powerful lever for this is using shared resources. Now, as we will see, shared resources are not the only lever we have. Another really important aspect is department sort of subject-specific CPD. If I do make one more curriculum primer video, it will be about subject-specific CPD, but for the time being, I think I'll probably leave it here. So what we'll look at today is shared resources, but this is not necessarily the end of the story. So for me, in my experience of being a head of department and working with lots of heads of department in my capacity as a science lead, and also just in terms of more general curriculum work, is that the three things that make for really effective curriculum or shared resources within the department are: one, having really good questions or tasks, you might say, as we'll see, that really prompt students to think deeply in terms of the subject's concepts. Two is examples and support for high quality exposition and modelling, and that's something that again can be centralised and shared to support every teacher to do the best job possible. And finally, considerations around format and structure, just to make lessons run super smoothly, regardless of who is delivering it. So if we look at these in more detail, you can imagine the shared resources being useful for two groups of people, I think. So firstly, students, and then staff. And I'm just going to talk through each of those three that I just talked about, and the kind of questions that I think middle leaders should be asking themselves and senior leaders should be asking of them too. So in terms of the questions, the first thing to think about is, do the questions really prompt students to think hard? And that's not just think hard in terms of going into their memory, but it's always relating back to the big ideas and concepts that are organising those sequences of lessons. So we saw those kind of back and forth diagrams that I drew in the previous example to try and illustrate this way that we constantly through a curriculum move between particulars and these more general organising concepts. So the question is, to what extent are our tasks actually prompting students to do that? And we'll look at some examples and non-examples in a minute. And from the point of view of staff, to what extent are those questions providing opportunities for them to do really high quality formative assessment and give feedback to students? So from the student's point of view, the questions need to really get them thinking hard, because that's how they're going to build knowledge, because they're using concepts across a variety of contexts, as we shall see. For staff, yes, obviously it's a help that their students are going to be doing that, but it's also an opportunity for them to make sure, okay, how much is this helping me to really nail down whether every single student is thinking in terms of the concept that I want them to think about. So there are two questions to think about with questions within the shared resources. Next, in terms of exposition and guidance, firstly, whether this is pre-prepared resources or whether this is modelling that happens live in the classroom or within an exposition. But are there examples of excellence that students can learn from? And from the student's point of view, they just really need to see the discipline in action, whether it's through a teacher modelling or some sort of resource that's been prepared in advance, but they need to see what disciplinary excellence looks like. That's what they're going to learn from. And from the point of view of teachers, does every teacher have an opportunity to succeed? Has guidance been put in place about what excellence looks like, and how teachers can relate whatever they're modelling or whatever they're explaining back to this big idea that organises a sequence of lessons? Is there guidance in place to support staff to do that effectively? And I think that is another thing that really sets apart the very best shared resources that I've seen. And then finally, in terms of the kind of format and structure, there's a point here about to what extent are we helping students to acquire knowledge through a clear and consistent format, but also to remember it. What retrieval is in place, what other resources like knowledge organisers, self-quizzing, and then there's a broader curriculum question about, are we giving them opportunities to revisit things and practice them again and avoid forgetting? So there's a question there to be asked about the shared resources and how we support teachers to bring that to life for students. And then, yes, from the teacher's point of view, obviously a huge part of teaching is about routines. It's about creating a classroom culture. And I suppose the question here is, do the resources that we're using support teachers to do that? Yeah, and again, people will have lots of different views on this, PowerPoints, booklets, worksheets, whatever it might be. But I think this is the key question that we need to be asking ourselves and reflecting on in those conversations between middle and senior leaders. So just to show you some examples and non-examples here that I think define or help illustrate, I suppose, what really good shared resources may and may not look like. So I think in terms of the questions first, I think really good sets of shared resources, they're going to have lots of questions and tasks in, so whether they're multiple choice, extended writing, or just whatever questions they might be, even gap fills and things like this can be fine, provided the focus is on using concepts. So an example here might be, let's take a science or this would be a PE example as well. Yeah, what we don't want, maybe let's start with the non-example first. It's quite easy to design lots and lots of tasks that focus on what I call abstract recall. So students are pulling a word that doesn't really have a lot of meaning to them from their memory. They're writing it down. The teacher infers from that they understand it, but actually the depth of understanding is it could be quite shaky. So an example would be, yeah, from the cardiovascular system, we might say, I don't know, in which part of the lungs does gas exchange take place? And students, they could be given multiple choice, or they could just have to retrieve it. It could be, okay, the alveoli, great. They can all answer it. Do they know the first thing about what's going on during gas exchange and how that relates to the broader respiratory and circulatory systems? Maybe not. Maybe they do, but maybe not. We can't be sure about that. It's not necessarily prompting really deep thinking. They might just remember, okay, gas exchange, alveoli. The kinds of questions we should be asking are questions of the form, why might smoking be detrimental to an athlete's performance in a 100-meter race or something like that? So the broader concept is there in a very particular concrete context, and I think that's really, really important. So in that case, you would give them multiple different options, and what you want to do is test out some misconceptions. So one of them might be some sort of misconception that maybe smoking doesn't have an impact on athletic performance. One might be it's to do with glucose instead of oxygen, and so on and so forth. But the point is that through that example, you want to really get them to use the concept in a concrete context. So another great example, I stole this from Jonathan Grand, who is the history lead for ARC schools and just a really brilliant curriculum thinker. This was at a session at the conference that I mentioned in a previous video, the ARC Zone conference in February of 2024. And he gave this lovely example of a non-example would be, let's ask a student's question, okay, what's the definition of militarism? And most students, especially if it was multiple choice, they'd pick the one with the word army, and they'd kind of get, well, militarism is something to do with armies, that's probably it. What he said is, what's going to be a much more effective and powerful example is to say, such and such person is a militarist leader, what would they be most likely to think? and give them some options of positions that could be held by different leaders, and ask them to identify which of those is a characteristically militarist position. That is using the concept rather than just recalling an abstract definition. So those sorts of things, and avoiding just questions that could be answered without really having to use the concepts. That's what makes for really powerful shared resources in terms of the questions. The other example, and this is maybe more for maths and the kind of quantitative parts of the sciences, but what's really helpful is when you see lots and lots of examples across a range of contexts, and what students are doing is having to spot how the concept applies to a concrete context. There's a problem here when we just give them a procedure and we get them to practice it multiple times by plugging in different numbers. The depth of thinking required there isn't that high, and therefore, while they will learn something, they maybe don't learn as much as we want them to do. I think I should have put in here as well, actually, one last thing on examples. Exam questions, in my experience, certainly in science, I'm not sure if this is the same for every subject, certainly in science, exam questions aren't generally very good curriculum resources, because what we want to do within the curriculum is get students to apply a particular concept. Let's say the concept might be concepts to do with cancer. This is an example that I actually saw in school, so concepts around cancer. We want to apply that across a range of concrete contexts. So we want to see different forms of cancer, let's say, so throat, lung, colon cancer, whatever, and show students that that concept is the same across each context. And what I saw in a lesson was an exam question was used, and the questions were organized around the context of cancer. They were all related to cancer somehow, but actually what those questions were asking weren't really anything to do with cancer. They were actually it was things like, if you've got a cancer in this part of the digestive system, explain why you can't digest fat so effectively, or something along those lines. And actually that's an even broader point, which we can't go into in this video, but whatever tasks you're asking students to do are getting students to think about the exact concept you want them to be using in that lesson, and being really, really precise about that. So that's the questions. The final thing that I'll talk about here is to do with the exposition and modelling. So in terms of the examples, I think what's really helpful is for teachers to have examples of exposition or modelling. So in science, I draw lots of diagrams. In maths, I know lots of departments, certainly within Greenshaw Learning Trust, lots of departments work together to come up with kind of best methods and so on, and kind of share those across the teams. And the important part is that you have some guidance here. So in history, you might have a resource which is a kind of story or a narrative containing lots of things that relate to one overarching inquiry question. But the important thing is it's not just a blank thing there to be used without any further thinking, that there's some guidance there on what the teacher should do with that. And I think that's what makes for really powerful shared resources. Pardon me. And the final, and a non-example with that would just be PowerPoint slides or booklets or whatever, just with the bold information, just a load of facts, and without any guidance on how the teacher can bring that to life. Final thing is to say exactly the guidance here is focused on using the concept. What we don't want is guidance which is, here are the 5 steps on how to solve this sort of equation, and get students to just follow this kind of abstract algorithm. It's more the guidance that shows teachers exactly how you relate this thing that you're talking about within a lesson to that big idea that organizes the sequence of lessons, as we saw. So how can we support teachers in making the links between ideas explicit? So there's what I think are some useful pointers for senior and middle leaders in reflecting on the quality of shared resources. I've got lots of examples and non-examples that I can share separately on this, and hopefully they will be useful in stimulating those curriculum conversations.